Hey, it's Phil from smilinggardener.com. And today I want to share some really interesting information about plant predators, or we often call them pests, and that means insects and diseases. So plants manufacture various, let's call them compounds, some of them being fairly easy for them to make and some of them being more complex. So the easiest are sugars. And we've all learned that sugars are made during photosynthesis, or maybe we forget that part, but we know, I love this image here of a plant. So we know photosynthesis is as a plant taking in sunlight, taking in photons from the sun, taking in carbon dioxide from the air, and then from the soil taking in minerals and water. And then that's called photosynthesis, and we know that it makes more plant. But the simplest first thing a plant creates there are various forms of energy, and one of them being sugar that creates out of that. And so actually what's really interesting about this is that plants will take sometimes more than 50% of the sugars that are created during photosynthesis, send it down through the roots out into the soil in order to attract the specific microorganisms that they want to be partnering up with and to feed those microorganisms. And so the microorganisms in return, we're talking about bacteria and fungi and other microorganisms, are going to bring minerals and water and other substances to the plants in exchange for those sugars. So it's a nice bartering system that goes on here. And I like this photo here is a good example. When we look at the roots of legumes like vetch and clover and alfalfa and lupin, we can see these little homes that are created on the roots of plants, and the plants actually help create them, and bacteria live in there. And so bacteria, I don't want to get into the process of nitrogen fixation in this video, but bacteria do good things there in exchange for sugars. Most of the microorganisms in the soil, though, we can't see because they're microscopic, but this happens with all plants. Now with those minerals and other substances that the plants are getting from these microorganisms, they can start to build more complex carbohydrates than just sugars. And then they can build proteins and fats and eventually phytochemicals such as antioxidants. And so this process isn't totally linear. It's not as though the plants make all of their carbohydrates before they start working on proteins, but when plants don't have optimal growing conditions, they have an easier time creating carbohydrates than they do proteins, and an easier time creating proteins than they do many of the fats. And so we can think of this process partially as where the lower items in the series or in the chain are like a base for the more complex items. And so we can think of it like sugars are needed to make carbohydrates, are needed to make proteins, to fats, and then to these phytochemicals. Struggling plants will have some point in that chain where they aren't doing a great job synthesizing those compounds and everything that's further on in the chain than those compounds. And so where this gets really interesting is that plant predators, again, we often call them pests, will visit plants that are at a certain point in that chain. And so what I want to share today, I learned actually from Dan Kittredge, who's the founder of the Bionutrient Food Association. Let's start near the bottom of the chain with carbohydrates. And so if a plant isn't even able to manufacture its carbohydrates, which are relatively simple to manufacture, you're going to see them have problems with soil-borne diseases. And a disease means microorganisms. And so that you'll see things like fusarium, pythium. And so you know when these diseases are causing a lot of problems, that your system is really out of whack because these are relatively simple compounds and your plants aren't even able to make them. And so I have a photo here of a pythium root rot, which is a very common root disease. Next is proteins. If a plant can't manufacture all of its proteins, you're going to see more of the larval stages of various insects. So you know some insects start out very differently than they become. So like a caterpillar becomes a butterfly. And so you're going to see the larval, the infant forms of these insects. So like caterpillars and tomato hornworms and grubs. And so that's what's happening. Yeah, so when you see that, you know that your plant is having trouble manufacturing its proteins. Now on to fats. So if a plant isn't able to manufacture all of its fats, you're not going to have that really nice, glossy, waxy shine. And you're also going to see more of the airborne diseases. And that's ones that I get a lot of questions about. In these comments in this series, I've been getting questions about blight and mildew. And so even as we get kind of halfway up the chain here, a lot of plants are having trouble manufacturing even their proteins and especially their fats. So we see these airborne diseases a lot. And last, we're on to the phytochemicals. So if a plant isn't able to manufacture these more complex compounds, antioxidants and thousands of other phytocompounds, you're going to see beetles, which are higher level insects. And these insects are causing a lot of problems nowadays, especially I have a photo here of Japanese beetles, which are causing a lot of problems around the world. And so when a plant isn't able to manufacture these phytochemicals, which is common in most plants that are grown these days, most food plants, you're going to have food that doesn't taste as good. And so in the last video, I was talking about how kids don't like their vegetables anymore, and this is a big reason, because phytochemicals are responsible for a lot of the flavor of food and the smell of food too. And it's also, I believe, one of the reasons why I caught the flu a couple of weeks ago, because I didn't have access to this food. Most of our grocery store foods don't have all of these different phytochemicals in abundance anymore. It's also, I believe, why we have so much disease in our world right now. Again, one of the reasons is because our plants just aren't providing us with these chemicals that are so important for fighting off disease. Of course, the stage we really want to get to is when a plant can manufacture all of these compounds, the sugars, carbohydrates, proteins, fats, and the phytochemicals. And when that happens, the plant predators just go away because they're looking for one of these imbalances. And if your plants don't have that imbalance, they're going to look somewhere else for food that they can actually digest. And so we're still in the process of trying to figure out all we can do with this really interesting information. For right now, let's say I have a tomato with late blight, which is another question I think I've received in these comments, or I certainly receive it regularly. And I look into this list, this chain, and I think, well, it seems that my plants are having trouble manufacturing their fats. We know overall that we need to make sure the plant has all the things we've been talking about in this series, the proper sunlight, air, temperature, water, and then especially the beneficial biology and the chemistry, the nutrition. What we do know is the more we do to optimize garden health, which is what I'll be showing you in this checklist in a couple of days, the better plants will be able to manufacture all of these compounds, and so the fewer pests we'll have. So we've been talking about biology and chemistry in this series, and if you're interested in learning more about how we can use biology and chemistry to decrease pests in our garden, I'm going to link right below this video to another article I wrote last year that I just updated yesterday, where I talk more about that in more detail. And as I said last time, fewer pests is just the beginning of the benefits we get when we focus on growing the healthiest garden possible. So we get much more nutritious food as well, better flavor, increased yields, and better storage time. So we can store that food through the winter so we don't get the flu like I did this year. And so we can see a lot of these benefits in this email I received from Ed, who's a member of my academy. He says, I just cut a 5.5 pound cabbage and only found 2 cabbage worms in the lower leaves. If you grow cabbage, you know cabbage worms are pretty common. He says, lots of squash, cukes, and lettuce, and our beets are 2 inches in diameter and everything tastes great. So I love notes like this. You can see a lot of the benefits right there. Things tasting great, better yields, bigger food, and fewer pests. And again, I'd love to continue this conversation in the discussion area down below. This discussion area is cool because I can use it for all 4 lessons, so we can keep the discussion going. So even if you've already contributed, if you have another question, you're welcome to keep the discussion going down there. And the question I've been asking is, what problems did you have in your garden in this past year, or what questions do you have for this upcoming year? Or again, if watching these videos has inspired another question, feel free to ask it, and I'm answering all the questions fairly quickly these days. So that's all for today. I'll have that checklist coming up in 2 days, and we'll see you soon.